Well, welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Randy Wyckoff, the Dean of the College of Public Health at ETSU, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the first Leading Voices in Public Health lecture for the 2013 calendar year. Tonight we're really pleased to have our second, what we call Rethinking lecture. Last year we did Rethinking Food, this year Rethinking Water. And the idea behind the Rethinking lecture is to bring in a world-class expert to give us a perspective on something that we see and think about all the time, but it's becoming increasingly important in public health for reasons other than maybe we historically think about. So water we've always thought about in public health as a vector for communicable disease or as a physical force for floods or tsunamis. But tonight we're very pleased to have Dr. Lawrence talk to us about rethinking water and a new reason, a new set of reasons to think about its public health impact. As we did last year, we're going to have the Rethinking lecture introduced by one of our students. Rachel Ward is one of our doctoral students and the manager of the ETSU Farmers Market, who helped to organize last year's lecture and to help this year as well. So please join me in welcoming Rachel Ward.
Thank you. Well, we're delighted to have Dr. Robert Lawrence speak to us about the link between industrial agriculture and water as part of our Leading Voices Rethinking series. Dr. Lawrence brings a unique perspective to this issue. He's a professor and the founding director of the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health's Center for a Livable Future, which is an interdisciplinary research center that focuses on the relationships between diet, food production, and human health, and emphasizes sustainability, equity, and protecting the Earth's resources. And as a side, I strongly encourage you to look at the center's website. It's very interesting. In his career as a physician and public health leader, Dr. Lawrence has held a number of notable professional appointments that have touched many facets of healthcare and public health, including that of former chair of the United States Preventative Services Task Force in the Department of Health and Human Services. He's also the recipient of many distinguished awards, including the Albert Schweitzer Humanitarian Prize. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Robert Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Rachel and Randy, for those kind words, and welcome everyone. When Randy called me last fall and asked if I would do something about water, I responded immediately positively, even though I felt a little bit fraudulent because most of my work related to water has to do with its association with food production. Either the necessity for abundant amounts of water to make our crops grow, or conversely, the significant destruction of clean water by the progressive industrialization of our food production system. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the connection as I see it. First, I need to go back and say that I don't have a financial interest, arrangement, or affiliation with any organizations that could be conceived as a real or apparent conflict of interest, and that I will not be discussing any unapproved or investigative use of a commercial product. I commend East Tennessee State University for insisting on this. We are struggling with conflict of interest throughout our professional lives these days. Here's one of my heroes, a neighbor of yours in Kentucky, Wendell Berry. Wendell is a writer, a farmer, an essayist, a poet, and a fierce opponent of mountaintop removal coal mining in eastern Kentucky. He's also very insightful when it comes to the relationship between our food system and health. And as he commented, there's no connection between food and health, that we're fed by a food industry which pays no attention to health, and we're healed by a health industry that pays no attention to food. When I graduated from medical school many years ago, the only instruction I had had in nutrition was to learn the essential amino acids, and that was it. And there's so much more to understanding food systems than that. So when we began thinking how a school of public health might approach some of these interconnected problems of health and food, diet is a stalwart part of public health. Research, teaching, and practice has been for over 100 years. Every public health school in the country had people who are working on some aspect of human nutrition. Similarly, just as your school has a Department of Environmental Health, this has been present for many years. We have a hero at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, Anna Bacher, who is one of the early pioneers, working with people like Rachel Carson to outline the health threats of an increasingly contaminated environment. But the food production side of things has been notably absent in most schools of public health. We defer that to the land-grant universities, departments of agronomy, departments of soil science, and so forth. And in many ways, that's an appropriate place. But given what has happened to agriculture in the United States since World War II, the progressive industrialization, it now impacts diet and environment in ways that profoundly influences the health of the public. And then there are these external drivers: population growth, climate disruption, lack of equity. We have 7 billion people in the world. We have 1 billion people who are malnourished and many hundreds of millions who go to bed hungry every night. And yet we have enough food being produced in the world to feed an estimated 8 or even 8.5 billion people. And then finally, we have resource depletion, and no resource is more important to food production than water. So just a quick review of the hydrologic cycle that I think everyone in this room will be familiar with. But if you think about evaporation of water from the sea, rises in the atmosphere, and then it precipitates out when the dew point is exceeded, comes down as rain, replenishes surface waters in rivers and lakes and streams, recharges deeper aquifers, and ultimately is used in a variety of 70% or so of it is used for agriculture. The rest is used for household use, municipal systems, and industry. And it varies by the season. So this animation shows the cycle as the seasons change, and you have this northern hemisphere growing new crops, new vegetation, while the southern hemisphere is in the fall and winter months, and then it reverses. This is a very dynamic system that constantly is involved with the generation of fresh water. This area here that's moving from east to west is called the Intertropical Convergence Zone. And the warm waters around the equator generate even more water vapor. The water vapor then spins off, and you'll see that in both the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, the prevailing winds are from the west. And the dark orange areas are precipitation. So these plumes of hypersaturated clouds coming off the Intertropical Convergence Zone then replenish the surface waters through precipitation, and we have this continuing restoration of our freshwater supply. Fortunately, the areas that we live in, the eastern part of the United States, the temperate zone, ranks fairly high up on the scale of rainfall. But there's a big mismatch between population density and the hydrologic cycle. Look over here where in the upper Amazon basin, some of the highest recorded rainfall amounts occur. About 16% of the total hydrologic cycle is concentrated in the Amazon basin, where only 1% of the world's people live. Up here in the northern China plain, which is their breadbasket where they grow grains to feed animals and people, China now has about 19% of the world's people, and it gets something around 9 or 10% of the hydrologic cycle. So just as an example of how important water has become as an international commodity, the Brazilian tropical rainforest is being cleared to grow soybeans. The soybeans are then shipped to China to feed the 450 million hogs that the Chinese consume each year. I'm going to come back to both of those points a little bit later. Now, if you look at this chart of water scarcity, we have two types of water scarcity. We have physical water scarcity, the southwest of the United States, the Gobi Desert, the central area of Australia. But we also have in this dark purple area economic water scarcity. I'm going to go back to the previous slide. Notice that this entire area of sub-Saharan Africa has actually quite an abundant annual rainfall. And yet, that whole area is locked in poverty, and the economic scarcity means that there are insufficient resources to pump the water, to filter the water, to purify the water, to create reservoirs, to have piping to provide domestic water supplies, and to have pump irrigation for agriculture. Other parts of the world which have economic water scarcity are also areas where there's actually abundant rainfall if we just managed it properly and if the resources were there to use it creatively. As you watch the globe spin, the lights show where electricity is being used. See how dense the North American area is. And then once again, when we roll around to those areas of economic water scarcity, it's not too surprising that we have a real dilemma on our hands. Here's that one area in Southeast Asia, and then the entire area of sub-Saharan Africa. So how is our water being used? The surface water, about 39% of it, this is withdrawals of water in millions of gallons per day. About 39% of it is coming for irrigation purposes, and then 61% is for household use, municipal use, and industry. But the groundwater is a totally different picture. 68% of our groundwater is used for agricultural purposes. And whether it's in the western United States where the Ogallala aquifer water table is declining annually, or whether it's in the Punjab, the breadbasket of India, where it's going down at a rate of about 18 centimeters per year, or in the northern China plain where it's going down at about 20 centimeters per year, the groundwater is being pumped out faster than it's being recharged. And this, if any of you have flown across the country on a clear day and had a window seat, you've observed these patterns on our southwestern landscape. Colorado and parts of Arizona and so forth. And these are all these irrigated fields with water that's being drawn up from deep aquifers of the Ogallala. And why are we drawing up water in such great quantities, not just in the United States, but increasingly in other parts of the world? It's because we need a lot of water to grow the feed, to produce the meat that we consume. In the United States, you see that I was talking to a couple of grass-fed beef producers here, and they're okay. If everybody ate grass-fed beef, we wouldn't be in the pickle we're in. But unfortunately, most of beef consumed in the United States is from large feedlot operations with intensive row crop production and grain-fed rather than grass and pasture-fed. So here's the line for beef. You see it's been pretty stable. Per capita consumption of beef hasn't changed much. This little bump and decline here overlaps very nicely with the Framingham study and with our first real awareness of the public health consequences of a high animal fat diet. And people began to cut back. But look at this inexorable rise in chicken consumption from about 150 pounds per person per year to 225 pounds. Now, one of the most startling things about our total meat consumption in the United States today is that about 8 billion, with a B, broilers are consumed annually by all of us. That calculates roughly to 1 million broilers per hour, 24/7, 52 weeks a year. So in the time that we're going to be together tonight, 1 million broilers will have been killed and consumed by our fellow Americans. The per capita total then has increased from about 196 to 274, and it has actually in the last few years leveled off. So we are beginning to bring it under control. But the global meat consumption continues to increase. So we now have pounds per capita. Back when we were eating about 196 pounds for every American, globally it was about a fourth of that, 47 pounds per capita. Now it's up to 85 pounds. Another way of framing this issue is that the average American diet, about 65% of our dietary protein is from animal sources. The world average is about 30%. And there are many societies that are very healthy with averages of about 5%. So some animal protein is really important. The bioavailability of things like heme and B12 and lysine make it important that either a very, very fastidious attention to a broad array of grains, fruits, and vegetables, or a modest amount of animal products to have a balanced diet. The estimates for different parts of the world, I've already mentioned that China is now consuming about 450 million swine per year. It's going up. The projection now is going to be about 85 million metric tons of meat being consumed in China by 2010. India, which has a large number of people who are still vegetarians, is growing only modestly. Other developed countries, we've already peaked, and it's a modest increase, but the real change is going to be taking place in low and lower middle income countries. So what does all this have to do with water? Did I forget that last year you talked about food, and this year you wanted to talk about water? Well, this is why it's all about water. A meat-based diet consumes far more resources than a plant-based diet. It takes about 700 kilos of grain to produce 100 kilos of beef. And you can see the ratios for pork and poultry. Poultry is the most efficient in terms of converting feed to flesh for consumption. But here's the killer, and this is what ties this whole presentation together. It takes 1,000 kilograms of water to produce 1 kilogram of grain. Therefore, more than 7,000 kilos of water to produce a kilo of beef. Back to Brazil and soybeans. If the Chinese could import fresh water cheaply and grow their own crops, grow their own soybean, their own corn, to feed that insatiable appetite for pork, 450 million animals a year, they would do it. But it is far cheaper to package the 1,000 kilos of water in 1 kilo of soybeans and transship that to China to feed the pigs. So we have this trade-off. We have the hydrologic cycle and the population out of balance. You have an increasing appetite for meat consumption as societies become more affluent, and we have a dwindling supply of fresh water. And the animals are competing with human needs because of this high reliance on grains for food, for feed. A few years ago, we were asked, each center, each department at the School of Public Health was asked to capture everything that they did in one cartoon for a book that was prepared for the rededication of our school and the name change. So the Center for a Livable Future, we scratched our heads and we said, well, how can we try to talk about all the different things that we do related to the food system, to scarcity of non-renewable resources, to water problems, to hunger, to food insecurity, and so forth. And we came up with this. So the broad red plane is global population. The cheeseburger is the number of people that could be fed in the world if everybody started eating the way we do in the United States. And the big globe is how many people we could feed in the world with a predominantly grain-based diet, given the amount of food that's being produced. The late Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for having developed the high-yield variety of wheat in Mexico that was responsible, among other things, for the Green Revolution, he was asked by the Union of Concerned Scientists a few years before his death to do a calculation. And so these numbers are actually from Norman Borlaug's calculation. In 1990, there were 5.2 billion of us. We were producing enough food that if it were distributed evenly and predominantly in a grain-based diet, it could feed 6.2 billion. So we had a margin of safety of 1 billion people. In contrast, if all of that food produced in 1990 had those step-down inefficiencies of how many kilos of grain it takes to produce a kilo of beef, pork, or poultry, we would only have enough to feed 2.5 billion. And then Borlaug projected forward to 2025, when the estimate is that we'll have 7.9 billion. The United Nations is raising that a little bit. It's likely to be more like 8.1 billion. There has been improvement in agricultural productivity, and so it's thought that, again, we would have a safety margin of 1.5 to 2 billion people if we could get everybody to eat a predominantly grain-based diet with meat and animal products as a condiment rather than as the main course. However, Borlaug didn't factor into these projections climate change, and I'll talk about climate change in a few minutes. So what is the size of this system that we're talking about? Livestock outnumber humans in the US 5 to 1. For each one of us, 5 tons of animal waste is produced in concentrated ways, so it gets into surface water and shallow aquifers. 10 billion animals are slaughtered in the US for food, 50 billion worldwide. So here we are, 6% of the world's population, and we're consuming 20% of the world's animals. So we are literally eating high on the hog. 93% of those animals are poultry. We have 35 million cattle in the US produced each year for consumption. Now it's a little bit more than 100 million hogs, and then 9 billion poultry. This has enormous environmental impacts, and in no domain more than on our water. Yes, we do have air contamination, we do have soil contamination, but it's really the problems associated with water. This is a typical swine operation where each of these barns will have 1,000 to 1,200 animals. These open cesspits are euphemistically called lagoons, but they're really just big open cesspits. Typically, they have about 3.5 million gallons of raw sewage. And this is what it looks like. Coming out of the swine barn into the cesspit, and then notice the brown color of the stream. It's sprayed on spray fields, sprayed on the corn fields, the soybean fields. And this video was taken in Duplin County, North Carolina, on the eastern coastal plain. And some of the people living in that community, when the wind is blowing in the wrong direction and at a high speed, this liquid waste actually splatters the front of their houses and the cars in their driveway. So it's a huge environmental justice problem on top of an environmental pollution problem. And there's very, very large concentration. These are the air vents from the huge fans that blow hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and a broad array of animal danders, ketones, aldehydes, and other things that combine to produce what we call hog odor. And I don't know how many of you have ever been in hog country and know hog odor, but it's pretty disgusting. So surface water contamination then is tied in with a variety of problems associated with the industrialization agriculture. It's also, of course, our sewage treatment plants. If they're not properly maintained and so on, they may be releasing nitrogen and phosphorus loads into surface waters, rivers, and so forth through point source contamination. We have a lot of problems with industrial use of water, and the Clean Water Act that was passed during the Nixon administration in 1973 was in part stimulated by those famous outbreaks of spontaneous fire appearing on the surface of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland. But we've made a lot of progress since the Clean Water Act was passed. But one of the flaws in the Clean Water Act was that there was a huge loophole exemption for industrial agriculture. So these open cesspits, the discharges into local streams that inevitably occur during heavy rains and so on, they are not currently regulated by the Clean Water Act. But the pollution from downstream effects of the runoff of these excess fertilizers and excess animal waste, this map of the globe shows all of the hot spots. And you see that virtually the entire east coast of the United States, the Gulf of Mexico, the Baltic Sea, a good bit of the North Atlantic, and then around Korea and Japan. When we think then of what part of this are we going to try to solve first, we have to work on all parts of it. We have to control the deforestation of the Amazon, because not only is it an important regulator of climate, it's very critically important for maintaining the normal hydrologic cycle. When you destroy the tropical rainforest in a very short period of time, the actual alteration of the hydrologic cycle can be measured. And rainfall decreases. Areas, as shown in the next slide, this was once triple canopy tropical rainforest, and now it looks almost like a desert. And this was cleared for industrial production of soybeans, most of which is exported to China. Now, why doesn't this hit us in the store when we purchase the food that's being produced by these industrial processes? Because so many of the true costs have been externalized. They're not captured in the retail price that we pay for food at the grocery store. Some of the externalities that are, one way of thinking about this is that the profits are privatized and the costs are socialized. The costs are socialized to all of us because ultimately if we try to repair the environmental damage, that's a costly thing to do. It has to come out of our tax dollars. But the profits to the polluters remain in the hands of the polluters. So you deplete resources, water, soil, fossil fuel, and biodiversity. The soybean crop in the United States today, 93% of it is a single monoclonal species called Roundup Ready soybean, owned and controlled by Monsanto. Some of you may have followed the recent Supreme Court hearing where a farmer in Illinois purchased Monsanto Roundup Ready for his first crop, but then he had some of his land in wheat, and he was going to plant a second, riskier crop of soybeans that might not make it before the first hard frost. And so he went to the local granary, and he just bought soybeans that had been sold to the granary by his neighbors. And Monsanto was suing him for copyright infringement because, of course, all of the soybeans in the granary contain the same genetically modified organism that makes it resistant to glyphosate or Roundup. Pollution of resources by the products of fuel combustion, pesticides, animal waste, and fertilizer, that's all externalized. And then the economic, social, and health cost to communities. The people in Duplin County, quality of life has been degraded. If they wanted to move away, they can't sell their home. Who would want to come and buy a home where you have to say, by the way, I have to let you know that sometimes hog feces and urine is sprayed on the front of this house. And then finally, we also have lost quality adjusted life years in terms of adverse health effects. In particular, here's one of those clusters of homes with the spray field in the background. We've now got abundant evidence of increased rates of respiratory problems, nausea, diarrhea, headaches, and what people in Duplin County call plugged ears, higher rates of eye, nose, and throat irritation, and work that Steve Wing, who's an epidemiologist at UNC School of Public Health, has published about significantly more episodes of depression, anxiety, anger, and fatigue among neighbors of swine CAFOs. In Iowa, Jim Merchant, who the former dean of the School of Public Health at the University of Iowa, he did a very elegantly simple cohort study in which he compared children who were growing up on a corn soybean farm with children who were growing up on a swine farm. And the children on the swine farm had much, much higher rates of asthma. This has been replicated in other parts of the country. So there are real community health effects. One example in southern Maryland, a swine facility that had about 4,000 animals, and one of our doctoral students measured the water upstream at the site of the confined animal feeding operation, or CAFO, and downstream. And what she found was isolation of 200 presumptive Enterococcus species. There were about 100 colony-forming units of Enterococci per 100 ml of surface water, and about 10 colony-forming units per 100 ml in groundwater. The isolates downstream displayed patterns of antibiotic resistance similar to those observed in airborne samples from within the barn, that was going on as part of the study. These high levels of multi-drug resistant bacteria were clearly associated with one of the other problems of industrial food animal production, and that is the use of antibiotics as growth promoters and as chemoprophylaxis, prevention for the squalid conditions in which they live. Before I turn to a few comments about antibiotic resistance, though, I just want to bring us back to the way in which all these things I've been talking about are connected in our ecosystem, and that when we perturb one part of the ecosystem, it may end up with almost negligible changes, but downstream the changes accumulate, and before we know it, we've done major damage. So the normal stream in, say, areas of Southeast Asia, where the mangrove swamps have been removed in huge, huge quantities in order to produce the shrimp that we all enjoy so much. The mangrove has a variety of very important ecosystem services. It binds sediments, it absorbs inorganic nutrients, it slows freshwater discharge, it buffers against storms. That's just one piece of this whole puzzle that, in the interest of trying to raise more food and trying to raise it in an industrial way, has injured the ecosystem. Similar findings for seagrasses in our wetlands on all coastal regions around the world. Healthy, intact seagrasses bind sediments, they absorb inorganic nutrients and so on, and they are very important as hatcheries for invertebrate and fish larvae. If we think about ecosystem service value, and there's a whole field of economics now called Ecologic Economics, where people spend time calculating the benefits to us of different aspects of our ecosystem. You see that even rock and ice on a mountaintop has a certain amount of value, $2,000 per year, per hectare, or is this per acre? I'm not sure. I think it's per hectare. Temperate and boreal forest, about $1,000 per hectare. Tropical forest, way up, around $4,500. Wetlands, $6,000. So every time you think about a zoning permit that's issued by a well-intended city council that wants economic development in their small community, and they allow a developer to fill in a wetland in order to build the strip mall, nobody up to this point has said, well, not only is it a bad thing to fill in all our wetlands, but are we really sure that that big asphalt parking lot's going to generate $6,000 per year in eco-services to our community? Probably not. And then even the open ocean, of course, has a tremendous value to us. So if we start thinking in these terms, it puts water and the way in which we use it into a more focused economic perspective. It takes different amounts of investment to restore different losses in the ecosystem. Grasslands and rangeland are the easiest and cheapest. Temperate forests are close behind. But some of the coastal systems and the coral reefs that have been destroyed by climate change and by removal of mangrove swamps and all the other wetland damage that's been done are really very, very expensive to restore. So this is a future that is seen increasingly in parts of the world where water sources have been depleted and the natural cycle is becoming more extreme with floods and droughts alternating rather than having a steady flow of rainfall. And part of the problem that we can do something about in protecting our water is to look at this kind of animal production. In 2006, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization released this report, Livestock's Long Shadow. And they estimated that when you combined everything that I've talked about up to this point, the amount of grain that you have to raise in order to feed the animals, the pollution and the methane gases and the other things that come with highly concentrated waste systems, that land use changes when you cut down forest and replace it with pasture land, and you release carbon that has been stored in the forest and so on. It all adds up to about 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions can be traced back to producing McDonald's hamburgers and all the other beef that we consume globally. More than transportation. Some facts that many of you will know, but just a quick reminder. Methane has about 25 times the heat trapping capacity of carbon dioxide, and enteric fermentation, mainly in beef cattle and dairy cattle, causes about 71% of the US agricultural emissions of methane. The manure cesspits with anaerobic digestion produce another very large amount of methane, as do rice paddies. Nitrous oxide is even more potent than methane, 298 times the warming potential of CO2. And it stays around a long time, about 114 years. The top source of nitrous oxide are nitrogen-based fertilizers that we apply in increasing amounts in order to maintain the high levels of yields in the corn belt and the soybean belt. About 51% of all US nitrogen is used for fertilizers, for animal feed, and for pasture. You've probably seen this so-called hockey stick graph, CO2 levels in the atmosphere. They have been stable over millions of years, really. And then this is a blow up starting about 1800, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And you see how quickly it has spiked. We are now at about 388 parts per million of CO2. And there are climatologists who are very, very concerned that we may have passed the tipping point and that we're now going to be in a cycle of ever increasing accumulation of greenhouse gases. What will that mean? Well, we're going to have to readjust our industrial food system. We're going to have to seek ecologic methods. We're going to have to reform our current food production in order to take realization of the fact that in these dark brown areas of this global map, it's estimated that the losses in agricultural productivity by 2080 as a result of climate change are going to range from anywhere from 15% to 50%. Now, there are a few places, the high northern latitudes and the high southern latitudes, where actually agricultural productivity is going to go up with climate change. I don't know how many of you are gardeners, and I don't know what the hardiness zones are doing in East Tennessee, but I can tell you that in New England, where my two daughters live and where my older brother lives, my sister-in-law is a very avid gardener, and she began telling me 10 years ago that there were plants that now survive in her garden in Massachusetts that did not survive 10 or 15 years earlier. You can see this upward movement of hardiness zones that's taken place not just in our lifetimes, but literally in the last 20 years. Other effects on agriculture can be captured in this estimate from FAO. It varies by the crop. Maize or corn, wheat, and rice each have a slightly different profile. The mid to high latitudes, in other words, the Dakotas and Montana and Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and so on in North America, there's not going to be a huge difference, a little bit of a fall off. But in the lower latitudes, the southern parts of the United States, Mexico and so forth, you see that there's going to be quite a quick drop-off of productivity, even in very modest 1 to 3 degrees centigrade increments of temperature. So how can we save our water, reduce greenhouse gases, and save our planet? Well, we can do it by paying more attention to our diet. If you look at the greenhouse gas emissions from the food that is on our plate typically, 48% come from red meat and dairy, cereals, fruits and vegetables, chicken, fish, and eggs, beverages, oil, sweeteners, and condiments, a much smaller amount. So a question was asked in the state of New York by a couple of agricultural scientists at Cornell about 3 years ago, was how many people could the state of New York feed, what proportion of the New York population could the state feed on a variety of different diets? And they actually calculated the results for about 30 different diets, ranging from vegetarian low-fat to vegetarian high-fat to flexitarian, little bits of animal product, to high-meat, high-fat. And the baseline is that the current use of agricultural land in New York State provides about 22% of the food that all New Yorkers consume. And the optimal amount they were able to get to was 30%. And interestingly enough, it was not this diet over here with 0 grams of meat per day, but it was actually this diet with 63 grams of meat per day. And these are the number of acres needed for each individual depending on their diet. The reason that this acreage is slightly higher than this, despite what I just said about it being the most efficient, is that this diet allows better use of marginal lands, sloping land, some of the hills that I've seen today around Johnson City, thin soil cover, land that's really only appropriately used for perennial grasses and pasture and raising animals on pasture. If you have to rely on cultivated crops, the light blocks below, you see that you end up with pretty unremarkable change for the lower meat quantity diets, and then it jumps up for the high meat, high fat diet. But it's this use of perennial crops, whether it's for cereals that are consumed directly by humans, or whether it's cereals and grains that are first fed to animals with that step-down inefficiency. So if you like a lot of meat and you eat an average 381 grams a day, you require 2.5 acres to support yourself versus somebody down here at a little over half an acre. How does this tie in with our current policy? Current consumption in the United States is about 8.8 ounces of meat on a daily basis. The USDA recommends 5.5. In a calculation published in the Lancet for optimal climate change control, recommends 3.2. And then in terms of the ultimate optimal red meat utilization for climate change. Pressed the wrong buttons here. The optimal rate is 1.8, and the per capita consumption to stabilize livestock greenhouse gas emissions at 2005 levels by 2050 could be achieved if we were able to get ourselves down in this range. Thinking back then, if we reduced from these levels to this level, and you calculate the grain that would be saved and the water that would be saved that's used to grow the grain, we'd make a huge dent in our conservation of water. So I'll close with this slide because we have a program at the Center for a Livable Future called Meatless Monday. It was started by a former Madison Avenue ad agency creative artist, Sid Lerner, who lives in New York, and the Monday campaigns are in New York. But we, at the School of Public Health for the last 10 years, have been providing scientific and technical advice to the campaign. You might say, well, why one day a week? Why Monday? Well, those of you in public health know that every 10 years we have a new report from the Surgeon General, Healthy People. And in 2000, when David Satcher, former speaker at this series, was the Surgeon General, Healthy People 2010 said that the goal was to reduce consumption of saturated fat by 15%. Well, 21 meals a week, you look at your plate, think 15, first of all, what part of this is saturated fat? And then how can I separate off 15%? Impossible. And this is what often happens in public health. We make these broad pronouncements and then we don't really translate it into useful knowledge. So Sid had the idea, well, back in World War II, we had Meatless Mondays and Wheatless Wednesdays. Probably not very many people in this audience old enough to remember that. I remember rationing in World War II. Why not Meatless Monday? One day a week is about 15% of the week. So we launched the campaign. It's very modest. We're not going back to the levels that were proposed by the Lancet. We're really talking about something up in here. And you'd think from the reaction of the Beef and Cattlemen's Association, the Pork Council, and the Poultry Board, that we had just declared war on anybody who ever let a morsel of animal product cross their lips. We didn't. One day a week, try it. It will help get us back where our hydrologic cycle, our ecosystem, the plants we grow will be mostly eaten by humans first rather than by animals first, and we might have a chance of reducing our carbon footprint and the threat of climate change. So thank you very much for your attention.
Take a few questions?
Yes, happy to.
For those of you who haven't been in school for a while, if you just raise your hand, I'll know you want to ask a question.
I understand about the slaughtering process of animals. I've often been curious about, in the last 10 years that we see the vegetables that are ready to eat that have already been washed. Has that affected the water usage appreciably in comparison to the use of water in the processing of the meat?
I would say that's probably a very minor part of water usage. It is true that something I should have mentioned is the fact that another huge place we could save water is if we stopped wasting 40% of our food. That's the latest best estimate, is that when you look at wastage from farm to fork, first from farmer to wholesaler, wholesaler to retailer, retailer to the customer, and then what we do with the food, that's growing mold in the back of our refrigerator until we throw it out. 40% of all the food that we produce in the United States is wasted. And I think we'd gain a lot more if we could focus on cutting down on the waste rather than worrying too much about the fact that our greengrocers love to have really sparkling, fresh, clean fruit and vegetables in the display.
Tony?
Bob, that was a terrific presentation, and when you talked a little bit about sort of changing the planning codes and things like that, it made me think a little bit about places in the country where they're more progressive about getting citizen input about doing the right thing in planning. And I've heard, maybe you would address it, that we can reverse some of these bad policies of the past, and that there are perhaps regions of the country where we can even show in the United States that we're willing to start addressing sustainability and our footprint, which has been so ginormous and out of balance. Riparian areas being refurbished and renewed, et cetera.
Yes, that's absolutely, Tony. We are making some progress. I think people, as they begin to be more aware of the interrelationship between the way we use water, and particularly if we could frame the issue of eco-service benefits to the community in a more compelling way, then I think people would really be very much, the social will would increase and the political will would follow. In the Chesapeake Bay watershed, tremendous amount of attention is being paid now because just in the last decade, we've seen a real drop-off in the crab industry and in the oyster industry. The oyster industry is almost dead in the Chesapeake compared to what it was even 20 years ago. And now people really worry about it. They talk about it, and they are active in contributing to efforts to control runoff and pollution and all the rest of it. So you have to be an optimist to be in public health. And I think that we are beginning to see in different places around the country restoration of wetlands, enforcement of the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. But there are very powerful forces arrayed against us, and we have to keep making our message clear. We have to keep educating the public and carry on from there.
I was actually going to ask if someone else would make a comment. I know that there was a CAFO that was supposed to come to the area a few years back. I don't know if Dr. Sherman knows about it, but like 800.
You mean the one in Johnson County?
Yeah. Do you know what happened to that, or can you talk about that as maybe a jumping-off point for some discussion? The community kind of organized.
Well, the community organized against it, but there were a lot of other things that went on. There was stuff that went on in the family that affected what they were going to do with it, and I don't know where they're at on it. It's, as far as I know, it's not completely dead. I mean, they were already in the process of building the barns and putting the ponds in and everything, and it just sort of dropped off because of all kinds of external issues.
Does that recall there was a lagoon way up on that?
Yeah, it was up on slope, and they were going to put all the waste on a very steep slope, which is what had the community concerned.
One thing that drew public attention to the hazards of lagoon placement was in 1999, Hurricane Floyd, I believe it was, stalled off the North Carolina coast, and in 24 hours they had 14 inches of rain, and it flooded out. These were not on slopes, these were lagoons down in the lowlands, but it flooded out over 50 of them, releasing vast amounts of pollution into the river systems. The state of North Carolina has 26 identifiable river systems, and 23 of them are now polluted because of the fact that North Carolina ranks second only to Iowa in the number of hogs. They produce 11 million hogs a year in North Carolina. And they're all in confinement like this now. 40 years ago, North Carolina was producing a couple of million hogs, but they were all in small pasture-based operations with 30 or 40 or 50 animals. One other bright spot that I want to mention with relation to community engagement, community activism, there's a farm in southern Maryland called the Claggett Farm that was left to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation by the Claggett family when the older farmer died. And the Claggett Farm is about 200 acres. It had been growing corn and tobacco for 75 years. The soil was depleted, there was erosion, it was in terrible shape. And a young farmer, Michael Heller, who's been the lead farmer there for 28 years, he introduced a herd of red Angus cattle. He adopted rotational grazing. He turned the soil from depleted into rich, organic soil. Over 30 species of grasses and broadleaf plants are in the pasture now. Leaves the cattle in one section for a day or maybe 2 days at most before moving them on. So they have to eat everything that's there. They don't just eat the sweet stuff and allow the less tasty thing to ultimately take over, which happens with open pasture land. Secondly, he began to grow vegetables and created a consumer-supported agriculture project, half of which goes to Anacostia, the poor section of Washington, D.C., to a farmer's market where people who otherwise have little access to fresh fruits and vegetables, at least a small number of them, now have access on a regular basis to quality produce. And then the third thing, he started growing bushes and trees for riparian buffers and sold them to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation to plant to protect the runoff from agricultural lands into the tributaries that drain into the Chesapeake Bay. As you look around the country now, there are example after example like that of people who are really practicing ecologic agriculture, restoring the soil, a proper balance between pasture-based animal husbandry and fruits and vegetables. So I think there is hope.
Well, Bob, thank you again.
You're welcome.
As we like to say, we have some parting gifts for you.
All right.
You know, your very own College of Public Health mug and calendar and a few other
terrific,
items. We try to make items that are just slightly too large to carry on the plane. And then, quite seriously, your status as an honorary professor here in the College of Public Health.
Oh,
so when you get back, you can say you're the second person at Johns Hopkins to receive this recognition.
Thank you very much.
Hello. Just to remind you, the next Leading Voices will be March 28th, same location. We'll have Dr. Roberta Ness talking about what's happening to creativity and creative thinking in higher education. And then I believe the farmers market will open on April 4th. So a lot to look forward to. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm sure Dr. Lawrence will be happy to answer any questions individually for the next few minutes if you'd like. Bye-bye. Oh, by the way, sorry, forgot to tell you, there's some videos that were developed by Shara Lang's documentary film class that we're showing out there. We'll be showing them again at the end of tonight. They're all on water, different topics developed by the students themselves, and they're pretty good, at least the one that I saw earlier is. So thank you all. Good evening.